Death at Gallows Green. Chapter 36. It's a frightful turn of events, I very much fear. She has been missing for nearly a full day. A full day? Has all expectation of her safe return been given up? Not yet, not yet. But it would be wrong to entertain false hopes. All seems very dark. Beryl Bardwell, Missing Pearl, or The Lost Heiress. From the summer-like sunshine of the days before, the weather had turned cold and drizzly. Wisps of mist haunted the lanes like vagrant ghosts, and diamonds of raindrops dripped from every twig and thorn. It began to rain in earnest halfway to Gallows Green, and Kate was glad she had asked Pocket to drive her and Bee in the closed carriage. They carried with them a full basket supplied by Mrs. Pratt, who had insisted on sending the food she had prepared for their luncheon. Kate had brought it, although she knew Agnes would have little appetite. Some of the searchers might need food, though, for, of course, there would be searchers. And there were. When Kate and Bee alighted from the carriage, a crowd of men was just setting off from the Oliver cottage, booted and mackintoshed against the wind-driven rain. Kate and Bee went into the kitchen where Agnes was huddled beside the fire in the company of her neighbour, Mrs. Wilkins, a stout woman with a face like a cauliflower and a nose as red as a radish. Her rolled-up sleeves revealed arms that rivaled those of her husband, the Hamlet's smith, but her touch was gentle. She clucked softly to Agnes, petting her as if she were a child. "She went looking for the duck, I'm sure," Agnes was saying wearily when they came in. "If the duck can be found, Betsy will be found too." She began to softly cry, and Mrs. Wilkins pulled her to her ample bosom. There, dearie, don't take on so. Like as she'll not be found quickly, or she'll become dancing home on her own, and you'll have the pleasure of strooping her for giving her such a fright." With that practical observation, the fruit of nearly 2 decades of motherhood, she tucked the rug over Agnes's knees, greeted the visitors, and went to pour the kettle into the teapot. Kate took Agnes's cold hands in her own. "Tell me about the duck," she said. "The foolish thing was gone yesterday afternoon," Agnes wiped her eyes. "Betsy looked everywhere. The child was still looking when I called supper, and it was all I could do to get her to bed just before you came. I found her nightdress on the floor this morning, and her shirt and breeches missing." "I'm sure she's all right," Bee comforted. "She is a very level-headed child, and she knows the fields and river." Agnes's face was thin-lipped. "That's why I fear so," she said in a bragged whisper. "I'm quite sure she isn't lost. No child ever knew her way more surely than Betsy." The door burst open, and the rain and the wind gusted in. "Agnes!" Edward cried, and was across the room in 2 steps. Giles lingered at the doorway, looking on. "Oh, Ned!" Agnes sobbed, letting herself be gathered up and held in Edward's strong embrace. "First Archie and now Betsy. How can I endure it?" She buried her face in his shoulder while he pressed his lips against her hair. "We will endure it together, dear heart," he said, so low that Kate was the only other who heard. "And when she is found, we will be glad together." There was a long silence in the room while he stroked her hair, and she clung to him, both oblivious to all else in the room. At last Mrs. Wilkins coughed. "Well now," she remarked sagely, "here's the tea, and I shall be off." She poured 5 cups, found her shawl, and left with a nod at Kate and Bee, and a long look at the constable still on his knees, now beside Agnes's chair, her hands in his. There was a catch in Kate's throat when she looked up, feeling Sir Charles' eyes on her. She blushed, remembering her thoughts of that morning, and looked away quickly. "What's to be done?" she asked. The entire hamlet had mustered for the search. Sir Charles' brown coat was wet, and water dripped off his hat and down onto his shoulders. "There's no doubt she'll be found." He paused and stepped closer. "Edward has arrested the man who led Highfields Farm," he said in a lower voice. "A man named Napthon. We fetched him to the gaol at Manningtree this morning. He says he knew nothing about Archie's murder, but he admitted to letting the barn. He's named Todd and Brog in connection with the grain stored there." Kate glanced toward Agnes. She was gazing at the fire, her hand still in Edward's, and did not appear to be listening. Agnes had enough to bear without knowing this, at least not yet. "They'll be arrested quickly," she whispered. "Before the day is out, I hope." Kate was glad that the sergeant had been exonerated from the charge of poaching and glad that progress was being made toward the apprehension of his murderers. But the gladness could not lighten her heart just now. So Charles' declaration that Betsy would be found sounded confident enough, but she felt a coldness settle in her as she remembered that it was Betsy who had seen the grain thieves, had heard their voices and their names, and could identify them. If Todd and Brock had somehow learned what she knew and discovered that they were implicated in the constable's murder... Kate felt her throat tighten. If only we had known about them before. Her voice trailed away, but Sir Charles took her meaning and nodded. Yes, he added softly. If only we had known, we could have apprehended them before yesterday evening, but we did not. He touched her arm. The slightest touch, but deeply intimate, it seemed to her. There was nothing we could have done, Miss Hartley, knowing only what we knew. Biting her lip, Kate turned away. But she had known. She had known that Betsy was a witness to nocturnal activities in the barn and had suspected that something illegal was involved, and that it was somehow connected with the sergeant's death. She could have come immediately to Agnes and warned her to keep her daughter safe, or she could have told Edward to watch out for the little girl, or perhaps to Charles. Or she could have taken on the task herself and kept an eye on Betsy. She could have done many things, should have done them. But she had done nothing, except to think how she might turn the events of last night into material for Beryl Bardwell's foolish novel. Heartsick, Kate turned to the grey window silvered with the cold rain. Betsy was somewhere out there in that chilly damp, not a fictional girl, a character in one of her sensational stories, but a flesh-and-blood child whose alert, curious attention to the world around her had lured her into very real danger. Thinking of the possibilities, Kate's heart twisted within her. Was Betsy alive, or was she already dead?